The morning departure. The morning was bright and clear as James Livingstone guided his sleek, silent electric car into the private airstrip's parking lot. For years, he had made a ritual of arriving early at this small yet exclusive airport to savor a quiet moment before each business trip. The airport itself, though modest, felt like a sanctuary, a reward for the years of hard work and determination he had poured into building his company, Livingstone Aviation. James had come a long way from his beginnings. His journey had been marked by late nights, early mornings, and countless meetings where he was often the only person of color in the room. Now, he stood as the proud owner of a thriving aviation company, a leader in charter flights and luxury travel solutions. It wasn't just a job for him. It was a passion that he lived and breathed every day. As he parked and stepped out of his car, he looked across the tarmac where his private jet waited, gleaming in the soft morning light. The fuselage bore the company's logo, a sleek design that represented strength and ambition. It was a symbol of everything he had worked for, a testament to his perseverance and his refusal to be defined by the limitations others tried to impose on him. James adjusted his tailored navy suit, feeling the familiar weight of pride and responsibility. Today's trip would be crucial. He was flying to New York for a meeting that could potentially open up lucrative international markets for Livingstone Aviation. The contract on the table would not only propel his company into a new league, but also set a precedent for future expansions. However, there was a slight edge to his morning that he couldn't quite shake. As he approached the jet, a few of the ground crew members were standing nearby, talking in low voices. They stopped speaking when they noticed him, their eyes narrowing just slightly. It was subtle, but James had learned over the years to read the unspoken language of skepticism. The whispers, the glances, the expressions that suggested he was an outsider, a reminder that no matter how successful he became, he still had to prove himself again and again. Pushing aside the uneasy feeling, James smiled politely and nodded to the crew, receiving curt nods in return. He maintained his composure as he strode confidently toward the jet, each step echoing on the tarmac. He knew that his professionalism and restraint were often his best defenses against those who doubted him. But today, something felt different. There was a tension in the air, almost as if it were waiting for something to go wrong. As he began his pre-flight inspection, meticulously checking the windows, wings, tires, and engine, he noticed one of the ground crew members, a stocky man with a stern expression, approaching him. "Excuse me, sir," the man said, voice neutral but lined with suspicion. "Are you the pilot for this jet?" James paused, momentarily caught off guard. "Yes, I am," he replied evenly, maintaining his calm. "I'm also the owner." The man's eyebrows shot up, and for a brief moment, disbelief flickered across his face. "I see. Well, we just need to verify some things before you take off. It's standard procedure." James handed over his pilot's license and documentation, resisting the urge to question the sudden scrutiny. After all, he had been through this routine countless times. Everything should have been in order. And yet, the unease gnawed at him, a feeling he could neither ignore nor explain. As the man took his documents and walked back toward the control tower, James exhaled slowly, trying to shake off the apprehension. His phone buzzed with a reminder of his meeting in New York, the time ticking closer. He dismissed the notification, refocusing on his flight preparations. He wouldn't let something as trivial as a routine check disrupt his morning. But as he moved to the cockpit to settle in, he noticed two airport security officers standing at the edge of the runway, their stances tense and eyes locked on him. One of them spoke into a radio, his gaze scrutinizing James as if he were a suspect rather than the successful businessman he was. The familiar, suffocating feeling of suspicion settled around him. He had felt it many times in his life, in meetings, airports, restaurants, places where he was often met with doubt rather than respect. But this time, it felt different. This time, it felt more invasive, more targeted. Before he could start the engine, He saw the flashing lights of a police car making its way toward the runway. James's heart rate quickened, his hand instinctively reaching for his phone. He didn't know what was about to unfold, but he knew it wasn't good. As the police car came to a halt near his jet, two officers stepped out, their expressions unreadable but their hands hovering too close to their holsters for comfort. One of them, a tall, broad-shouldered man with mirrored sunglasses, called out to him, "Sir, step away from the aircraft." James raised his hand slightly, signaling his compliance as he climbed down from the cockpit. He forced himself to remain calm, though frustration and confusion simmered beneath the surface. "Good morning, officers," he greeted, keeping his tone polite. "I'm James Livingstone, the owner of this jet and the pilot for today's flight. Is there a problem?" The officer with the mirrored sunglasses gave a brief nod, but maintained a stony expression. "We received a call about suspicious activity," he replied curtly. "I'll need to see some identification." With a steady hand, James offered his ID, pilot's license, and all other necessary documents once more. The second officer, a younger man with an eager, almost smug expression, took the papers, glancing through them with little regard. "This your plane?" the officer asked, his tone thick with disbelief. James's patience thinned but remained intact. "Yes, it is," he replied firmly. "I've owned it for 3 years, and I've provided all the documentation to verify that." The younger officer let out a small scoff, clearly doubting the possibility. "Must be nice," he muttered, as if someone like James shouldn't be able to afford such a luxury. James bit his tongue, keeping his frustration at bay. He knew he could challenge them, demand answers for this treatment. But years of similar experiences had taught him that patience was his best weapon, even when it felt like swallowing shards of glass. He had learned that reacting too strongly could be exactly what they wanted. "We're going to need to verify these documents," the older officer said finally. "Step away from the aircraft while we sort this out." James took a step back, allowing them space, even as his mind raced with the implications. He watched as they retreated to their patrol car, speaking into their radios while casting skeptical glances in his direction. As he stood there, waiting, he couldn't help but feel a familiar ache, a weariness from years of having his success questioned, his legitimacy doubted. He had worked hard to build his reputation, and he refused to let this moment define him. Glancing down at his watch, he noted the time slipping away. His meeting felt like a distant goal now, one that would have to wait while he stood on this runway, under the scrutinizing eyes of men who had already decided what they believed about him. In that moment, James resolved to remain unshaken. He had faced prejudice before, and he would confront it again if he had to. But this time, he wouldn't stay silent. Not anymore. A call for help. James's heart pounded as he stood there, hands clasped tightly in front of him. The officers were still gathered around their patrol car, examining his documents with an exaggerated deliberateness, as though they were trying to find a fault that didn't exist. James knew he'd be standing here far longer than he should have, all because of their suspicions. His credentials were all in order, and yet they scrutinized him, as if he were a threat instead of the successful business owner he was. He stole a glance around him. The airport staff, technicians, and a few other passengers had started to gather at a distance, whispering to one another and casting sidelong glances in his direction. He knew what their looks meant. He'd seen them too many times before. The look that questioned his right to be here, that suggested he was out of place. After years of achieving, building, and succeeding, he had hoped he'd be beyond moments like this. But this was reality, the kind that didn't care about your achievements, only about assumptions. As he waited, he decided he would need someone with authority, someone who could intervene, and if necessary, hold these officers accountable. He pulled out his phone and dialed a number he rarely used, but one he knew was essential today. Rebecca Sterling, his longtime attorney and trusted confidant. Rebecca answered on the first ring. "James, what's going on?" she asked, her tone immediately alert. James could practically hear the clicking of her heels as she moved purposefully into action. "Rebecca, I'm at the airport, and I'm being detained by police officers who seem to believe I don't have any right to be here," James explained, keeping his voice steady, but feeling the frustration build with each word. "They're holding me up for a so-called document verification, but I know it's more than that. I've given them everything, and yet they're still questioning my ownership of the plane." Rebecca let out a slow breath, her voice calm, but with an edge of anger. "They're holding you without cause." "Yes, they are," James replied, glancing over at the officers still conferring with each other by the patrol car. "It's been nearly half an hour. They're calling in more checks, and it's clear they aren't in a rush to let me go." "Stay where you are," Rebecca replied firmly. "Don't answer any more questions. I'll be there soon, and I'll make sure they understand who they're dealing with." James ended the call, a small wave of relief washing over him. Rebecca had been with him through many legal battles, but this one felt more personal. This wasn't just about protecting his business. This was about defending his dignity, his right to be treated as an equal, to be respected as a man who had worked tirelessly to achieve everything he had. Just as he was putting his phone back in his pocket, the officers returned. Their expressions were hard, unyielding, as though they had already decided he was guilty of something, even if they couldn't quite determine what that something was. "We're going to need you to step away from the plane completely, sir," the older officer said, his tone clipped. "We're waiting for further verification." James's patience thinned. "I've complied with everything you've asked," he replied, his voice calm but firm. "I've provided my pilot's license, my ID, the ownership documents. What more do you need?" The younger officer, clearly enjoying the confrontation, sneered. "Well, we can't just take your word for it, can we?" he said, his voice dripping with condescension. "It's not every day we see someone like you piloting a jet like this." James inhaled slowly, forcing himself to maintain his composure. "Someone like me?" he asked, narrowing his eyes. "Yeah," the officer replied with a smirk. "Not exactly common for someone of your background to be out here flying private jets, now is it?" The weight of the statement hung in the air, charged with a hostility that James recognized all too well. It was a reminder that in their eyes, he was still an anomaly, a man who didn't belong, regardless of his accomplishments. His presence challenged their assumptions, their biases, and they didn't like it. The older officer glanced at his partner, perhaps sensing they were going too far, but rather than intervening, he just cleared his throat and muttered, "Look, we're doing our job here. Just cooperate, and this'll go a lot smoother." James nodded, though his patience was wearing thin. He wasn't here to teach these officers a lesson on professionalism, but he also wasn't going to allow them to treat him with disrespect. He straightened, his gaze unwavering. "I am cooperating. I expect the same respect I've shown you." The officer's smirk vanished, his mouth tightening into a thin line. "Watch yourself," he muttered, his hand resting near his holster. "We don't want any trouble here." The threat was clear, but James didn't flinch. Instead, he let his gaze linger on the officer, his silence speaking volumes. He knew that any further engagement would only escalate the situation, and he refused to play into their hands. Minutes stretched into what felt like an eternity. The officers continued to speak into their radios, casting frequent glances his way. James's gaze drifted to the airport terminal, where the small crowd of onlookers had grown. They watched him, some with open curiosity, others with barely concealed suspicion. It was a humiliating scene, and every second he stood there felt like another blow to his dignity. At last, a car pulled up. It was Rebecca's sleek, black sedan, and James felt an immediate wave of relief as she stepped out, her expression set and purposeful. Dressed in a tailored suit and exuding confidence, she strode toward him and the officers, her gaze steely. "Who's in charge here?" she demanded, her voice sharp and direct as she flashed her credentials. The older officer approached, his expression shifting from smug to slightly uncertain. "I am," he replied. "And you are?" "Rebecca Sterling, lead legal counsel for Mr. James Livingstone," she said, her tone icy. "What exactly is going on here?" The officer hesitated, clearly caught off guard by her assertiveness. "We received a report about suspicious activity involving this aircraft," he replied, though his confidence was clearly waning. "We're simply following protocol to verify." Rebecca cut him off, her tone leaving no room for argument. "Protocol? Mr. Livingstone has provided you with all necessary documentation, has he not? His pilot's license, his ID, and proof of ownership." The officer shifted uncomfortably. "Yes, but we still need to verify." "Let me clarify something for you," Rebecca interjected, her voice razor-sharp. "Mr. Livingstone is a respected businessman, the owner of this aircraft and the pilot for today's flight. You have no grounds to detain him. This verification you're waiting on, it sounds more like harassment than due diligence." The younger officer, sensing his authority was being challenged, stepped forward with a sneer. "We're just doing our job, ma'am. With fraud on the rise, we can't just let anyone." Rebecca held up a hand, silencing him with a glare. "If you're concerned about fraud, then perhaps your energy would be better spent investigating actual suspects, rather than harassing a man whose only crime is not fitting your stereotype of an airplane owner. I suggest you release him immediately, or I will ensure this turns into a very public issue." The officers exchanged glances, visibly unnerved by her threat. The older officer cleared his throat, shifting uncomfortably. We'll finish up here shortly," he muttered, though his bravado had noticeably faded. Rebecca turned to James, her gaze softening slightly. "I'm sorry you had to go through this," she said quietly, offering a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "Thank you, Rebecca," he replied, grateful for her presence and her support. She turned back to the officers, her expression once again hardening. "You've had more than enough time to complete your so-called verification. If you don't release him now, we'll be filing for unlawful detention." The officers, clearly realizing they had overstepped, grudgingly nodded. "Fine," the older officer muttered. "He's free to go, but we'll be keeping an eye on him." Rebecca's lips curled into a tight smile. "You do that," she replied, her voice dripping with sarcasm. "And we'll be keeping an eye on you." As the officers backed down, Rebecca motioned for James to follow her away from the patrol car. He exhaled, feeling a weight lift from his shoulders. Though the sting of the encounter remained, he'd been forced to defend himself, to endure yet another reminder of how others saw him. "Let's get you on that plane," Rebecca said softly, giving his shoulder a squeeze. "You have every right to be here, James. Don't let them make you doubt that." He nodded, deeply appreciative of her words, though a simmering anger lingered. As they walked toward his jet, he cast a final glance at the officers, who were now huddled together, muttering to one another. James paused, looking out over the runway, a surge of determination rising within him. This wasn't just a singular incident, it was part of a larger issue, one he could no longer ignore. He wasn't just a businessman anymore. He was a symbol, a representative for those who had faced similar challenges, and he would use his voice to speak out against this injustice. This incident would not be swept under the rug. James had a platform, and he would make sure it was used for something meaningful. And as he boarded his jet, feeling the familiar rush of excitement at the prospect of taking flight, he knew he was prepared to confront whatever obstacles lay ahead. As he settled into the pilot's seat, Rebecca's words echoed in his mind. "You have every right to be here." With resolve in his heart, he prepared for takeoff, knowing that his journey was just beginning. Breaking the silence, James adjusted the controls in the cockpit, trying to focus on the technical routine that usually brought him peace. But today, each switch he flicked and dial he checked seemed like a poor attempt to distract him from the churn of emotions simmering just beneath the surface. It wasn't just the irritation of the morning's events. It was the gnawing realization that no matter how high he climbed, the world seemed determined to remind him of his place, as if his success were an anomaly, something to be doubted rather than celebrated. As the engines roared to life, James took a deep breath and steadied himself. He was a man who had learned long ago not to react out of anger, but the injustice of the encounter clung to him like a shadow. There was a sense of powerlessness in that moment, standing on the tarmac, feeling accused simply for being who he was. But he knew he had something more powerful than anger. He had his voice and his reputation, and he intended to use them. Once airborne, with the plane ascending smoothly into the open sky, he allowed himself to consider his next move. This wasn't just a fleeting incident he could shrug off. It was a defining moment, one that demanded a response. He knew he couldn't be silent. Not this time. Too many people faced this sort of treatment every day, without the resources or connections to fight back. The city skyline of New York came into view far sooner than he anticipated, each towering building representing dreams that had been realized or crushed. James adjusted his course, finding a strange comfort in the cockpit's controlled environment. Here he was in command. Here he was free from scrutiny. As he landed at a private airstrip and taxied to a halt, he noticed Evan Richards, his business partner, waiting on the tarmac, his arms crossed and his face a mask of concern. Evan was tall, with the easy confidence of a man used to success, and while they came from different backgrounds, the two men shared a bond formed through years of building the company together. "James," Evan called, striding forward as soon as James stepped out of the jet. "I got your message. Are you all right? I heard there was an issue." James let out a dry laugh, shaking his head. "An issue would be putting it lightly," he replied. "Let's just say that being detained without cause doesn't sit well with me. Not after everything I've built." Evan's eyes darkened with understanding. "So it happened again." James nodded. He could see the anger flash in Evan's eyes, a shared frustration that reflected their long history of fighting for respect in circles that weren't always welcoming. "This time, it's different, Evan," James said, his voice steady. "I'm not letting it slide. We've worked too hard to get here, and I won't let them treat me like I don't belong." Evan placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "I'm with you, whatever you need. If you want to go public with this, our team will back you." James nodded, feeling a surge of gratitude. Evan had been with him since the early days of Livingstone Aviation, standing by his side as they navigated the challenges and doubts. Together, they had faced setbacks, closed major deals, and made Livingstone Aviation a respected name in the industry. But this wasn't just about business anymore. It was about changing the narrative for people who looked like him, people who faced doubts and suspicions regardless of their accomplishments. After their meeting with clients, James returned to his hotel room, his mind still restless. He looked out over the city lights, feeling a mix of frustration and purpose. He knew he couldn't do this alone. He needed allies, people who understood the stakes, who knew the weight of being judged before they could even speak. That night, he called Rebecca again, his resolve firmer than ever. As soon as she answered, he didn't waste any time. "I want to go public with this," he said, his voice unwavering. "I want to shed light on what happened, on what people like me go through just to be accepted, respected, and treated fairly." There was a pause on the other end of the line, and he could hear Rebecca's sigh, a mix of pride and caution. "I thought you might say that," she replied. "But you know this isn't going to be easy. Once we bring this into the public eye, there will be scrutiny, backlash. You'll be in the spotlight like never before." "I understand the risks," James replied. "But if we don't speak up, then who will? This is bigger than me, bigger than my company. This is about people who can't afford a lawyer, people who don't have the resources to defend themselves. I want to make sure this isn't ignored." Rebecca was quiet for a moment. Then he heard the familiar note of resolve in her voice. "All right then. Let's do it. But we'll do it strategically. This isn't just a story. It's a movement, and we're going to need the right people on board. The next few days passed in a whirlwind of calls, meetings, and preparations. Rebecca assembled a team of public relations specialists and civil rights advocates who understood the delicate balance of confronting systemic issues while protecting James's image and his company. Together, they crafted a plan that would allow him to share his story while minimizing the potential fallout. James knew that his decision would come with consequences, that his name and reputation would be subject to scrutiny, but he was ready to take that risk if it meant creating a lasting impact. Finally, the day came for him to tell his story. They had arranged a press conference, a carefully curated event where he would speak openly about what had happened and address the need for systemic reform. As he stepped onto the stage, cameras flashed, and journalists murmured, their attention fixed on him. He took a steadying breath, feeling the weight of responsibility settle over him. "Good afternoon," he began, his voice strong. "I'm James Livingstone, CEO of Livingstone Aviation. I'm here today not just to share my experience, but to address an issue that affects countless individuals who face bias and prejudice, not because of anything they've done, but because of who they are." He paused, letting his words sink in, feeling the room's energy shift as they began to listen. "Last week, I was detained without cause at an airport. I was questioned, doubted, and treated as though I were a criminal, despite having provided all necessary documentation. This isn't the first time something like this has happened, and unfortunately, it won't be the last unless we address the systemic issues at the heart of these incidents." The room was silent, the weight of his words hanging in the air. "I've spent years building my company, working alongside my team to create opportunities and make a difference in the aviation industry," he continued. "But in that moment on that runway, none of that mattered. To those officers, I was just another suspect. And that's the problem. It's not just about me. It's about everyone who faces this kind of prejudice every day." He glanced over at Rebecca, who gave him an encouraging nod. "I'm sharing this because change doesn't happen in silence. It happens when we speak out, when we refuse to accept the status quo. I stand here today not only as a businessman, but as an advocate for justice and equality. I'm calling for accountability and for comprehensive training to address bias within law enforcement, starting with the officers who serve our airports and transportation hubs." He paused, feeling a surge of emotion as he looked out at the crowd. Everyone deserves to be treated with respect and dignity, regardless of their background. And I won't stop until we see real, meaningful change. As he stepped away from the podium, the room erupted in applause, the sound echoing through the hall. He saw a few reporters rising from their seats, hands raised, eager to ask questions. He knew there would be more to say, more to address, but for now, he had said enough. He had taken the first step, broken the silence, and opened the door to a conversation that had been too long in coming. In the days that followed, the story spread quickly. News outlets picked up his speech, and soon social media was flooded with support from people across the country who shared similar experiences. Messages poured in from individuals who had faced the same prejudice, each one a reminder of why he had taken this stand. But there was also backlash. Some questioned his motives, accusing him of using the incident for attention. Others dismissed his claims, saying he was exaggerating, that racial profiling was a relic of the past. It was painful to read, but James had prepared himself for this. He knew that change was never easy, and that standing up for what was right would come with resistance. Undeterred, he continued to push forward. He began meeting with civil rights groups, joining forces with organizations that were already fighting for reform within law enforcement. Together, they drafted a proposal for new policies that would require bias training and accountability for officers, with a focus on airports and public spaces where such incidents were most common. James threw himself into the work, feeling a renewed sense of purpose. Each meeting, each interview, each article that highlighted his story became a step toward a larger goal, a movement he was determined to lead. Late one evening, as he sat in his office reviewing their progress, his phone buzzed with a message from Rebecca. Rebecca. Just received word from the police department. They're launching an internal investigation into the officers involved. It's a start. James exhaled, feeling a flicker of satisfaction. It was a small step, but it was progress, a sign that his efforts were beginning to make a difference. He leaned back in his chair, gazing out at the city lights. This was more than he had ever anticipated when he'd first set foot on that tarmac. But now he understood the importance of the fight he had taken on. This wasn't just about defending himself. It was about creating a world where others wouldn't have to. With a sense of determination, he prepared for the next step. He knew there would be more battles ahead, more challenges to face. But for the first time, he felt truly ready. Building momentum. The press conference had gone better than James had dared to hope. Support poured in from various corners. Prominent civil rights organizations, fellow business leaders, and even everyday individuals who felt a connection to his story. It was a rare and beautiful moment of unity, and James could feel the power of his words resonating far beyond the confines of his own experience. But as the days passed, the reality of his mission settled in. The backlash he had anticipated was beginning to rear its head. Some online commenters accused him of overreacting, suggesting that he was looking for attention, or worse, that he was playing the race card. Others questioned his integrity, calling him an opportunist or a businessman simply trying to drum up publicity for his brand. James sat in his office one evening, sifting through the comments online. He knew better than to take them to heart. Yet each one stung, a reminder of the resistance that had always accompanied efforts for change. He closed his laptop, letting out a heavy sigh. Even entered his office moments later, catching sight of James's expression. "They're really giving you a hard time, huh?" he asked, settling into the chair across from him. "More than I expected," James admitted. "I thought we'd have more support, especially from people who've been through similar situations, but it feels like every step forward is matched by someone trying to drag us back." Avon nodded thoughtfully. "People are afraid of change, especially when it challenges their assumptions. But you knew this wasn't going to be easy." James met his gaze. "I did, but knowing and experiencing it are two different things. And right now I feel like I'm in a battle I'm not fully equipped for." Avon leaned forward, a spark of determination in his eyes. "Then let's make sure you're equipped, James. We've got resources, connections, and a platform. Let's use them." James smiled, feeling a renewed sense of purpose at his friend's words. It was true. They had built a successful company, and now was the time to leverage that success to amplify the message, to make it undeniable. "All right," James said, his voice firm. "Let's get to work." Together, they began drafting a plan. They would organize a series of town halls and public forums, bringing together people who had experienced discrimination and those willing to listen. They would partner with advocacy groups, using their collective voices to demand policy changes within law enforcement and aviation security. They would even begin a petition calling for national reforms that would address profiling in transportation hubs across the country. In the following weeks, the campaign picked up speed. James was tireless, attending meetings, giving interviews, and speaking at every public forum that would have him. With each appearance, he shared his story, challenging audiences to question their own assumptions, to see the world through the eyes of those who faced suspicion and scrutiny simply because of their race. One evening, after speaking at a packed town hall meeting, James was approached by an older woman with a warm, weathered smile. She took his hand in hers, her grip strong and reassuring. "Thank you, Mr. Livingstone," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "My grandson went through something similar not too long ago. He was just a teenager, but they treated him like a criminal. He never spoke up about it, said he didn't want to cause trouble. But what you're doing, it's giving people like him hope." James felt a swell of emotion as he listened to her. Moments like these reminded him why he had started this journey, why he was willing to face the criticism, the resistance, the doubt. This wasn't just about him. It was about the countless others who didn't have a platform, who didn't have the resources to fight back. "Thank you," he replied, squeezing her hand. "That's why I'm here. So your grandson, and everyone else, can feel like they belong without having to fight for it." The woman nodded, her eyes glistening as she smiled. "You keep going, Mr. Livingstone. We're behind you." As the days turned into weeks, the campaign gained traction. National news outlets began covering his story in greater depth, interviewing others who had been victims of profiling and exposing the pervasive biases within certain sectors of law enforcement. Support poured in from all over, and the petition grew, reaching thousands of signatures in record time. But the higher James climbed, the greater the resistance became. One morning, as he was preparing for a radio interview, Rebecca called him with an urgent tone in her voice. "James, there's something you need to know," she began, her words clipped. "I've been monitoring the online chatter around your campaign, and it seems there are people trying to discredit you." James felt his stomach tighten. "Discredit me? How?" "They're digging up anything they can use against you, old business deals, even personal details. They're looking for anything they can twist into a narrative that makes you look like the bad guy," Rebecca explained. "It's not uncommon in cases like these. They're hoping to shake your credibility." James clenched his jaw. He had anticipated some resistance, but this was different. They weren't just attacking his message. They were going after him as a person. "Do we have any idea who's behind it?" he asked, his voice tense. Rebecca hesitated. "There's no clear source, but it's coming from a few anonymous accounts that seem to be well-funded. We're doing everything we can to manage it, but I wanted you to be prepared. They're going to come after you hard." James took a steadying breath, feeling the weight of the situation settle over him. He had committed to this fight, but he hadn't anticipated the extent to which some would go to silence him. "Thank you, Rebecca," he replied. "I appreciate the warning, but I'm not backing down." "I didn't think you would," she replied, a hint of pride in her voice. "Just know that you're not alone in this. We're all here to support you, no matter what." James ended the call, his resolve hardening. If they thought they could intimidate him, they were mistaken. He had faced worse obstacles in his life, and he wasn't about to let a smear campaign derail his mission. Over the next few days, the attempts to discredit him escalated. Rumors circulated, headlines appeared questioning his motives, and social media buzzed with speculation. But rather than backing down, James doubled his efforts, focusing on the stories that mattered. The stories of people like the grandmother at the town hall meeting, people who had suffered in silence for far too long. He knew that his fight was about more than reputation. It was about dignity, about ensuring that future generations wouldn't have to face the same obstacles he had. One afternoon, as he was preparing for a televised interview, Evan approached him with a concerned expression. "James, are you sure you want to keep going with this? They're hitting you from all sides, and it's getting ugly." James looked at him, a calm determination in his gaze. "Evan, we've been through tougher fights before. This one just happens to be more public, but I'm not stopping. Not now, not ever." Evan studied him for a moment, then nodded. "All right. Just know that whatever happens, I'm with you. We all are." As he sat in the green room, waiting to be called for the interview, James reflected on the journey he had taken to get here. He thought of the years of hard work, the barriers he had broken down, and the battles he had fought. This was just another challenge, one that he would face with the same resilience that had brought him this far. When the interview began, the host dove straight into the controversy, pressing him on the allegations, the rumors, the backlash. James held his ground, answering each question calmly and directly, refusing to let the attempts to derail him succeed. "I knew going into this that it wouldn't be easy," he said, his voice steady. "But I believe that change never comes without a fight. And if this fight means facing criticism, backlash, and resistance, then so be it. Because this isn't just about me. This is about creating a world where people are judged by their actions, not by their appearances, and I'm willing to do whatever it takes to make that a reality." The host watched him, a look of respect crossing her face. "It takes courage to do what you're doing, Mr. Livingstone. And regardless of where people stand, I think we can all agree that your determination is inspiring." As the interview wrapped up, James felt a sense of calm wash over him. He had faced the scrutiny, the criticism, the doubts, and he had come through stronger than before. In the days that followed, support continued to pour in, and the campaign reached new heights. Lawmakers began to take notice, and discussions of reform started to circulate within government circles. It was a small victory, but it was enough to fuel James's resolve. One evening, as he reviewed the latest updates from Rebecca and the advocacy groups, he received a call from a young man named Marcus, a law student who had been following his story. "Mr. Livingstone, I just wanted to thank you," Marcus said, his voice filled with admiration. "I come from a similar background, and I've faced my share of struggles. Seeing you stand up like this, it's given me hope. You're making a difference, sir." James felt a surge of pride as he listened to Marcus. "Thank you, Marcus," he replied, his voice thick with emotion. "It's people like you who inspire me to keep going. Just remember, you have the power to make a difference too. Never let anyone make you doubt that." As he ended the call, James looked out over the city, feeling a renewed sense of purpose. He knew that the road ahead would be long and fraught with challenges, but he was prepared for whatever came next. This fight wasn't just his. It was a movement, a mission, a promise to all those who had been silenced, doubted, and marginalized. With a sense of quiet determination, he prepared for the next step, ready to continue his journey and to lead the way toward a future of justice, equality, and respect for all, allies and adversaries. The city skyline gleamed in the early morning light, casting long shadows across James's office as he prepared for yet another day on the front lines of his movement. What had begun as a personal mission to defend his dignity had now evolved into a widespread call for change, one that was resonating with people across the country. The petition for reform had passed 100,000 signatures. Advocacy groups were reaching out for alliances, and the media was keeping a steady focus on the issues he was raising. But with each victory came new challenges. The backlash James had braced himself for was in full swing. Articles began surfacing that questioned his motives, insinuating that his campaign was a calculated move to bolster his business profile rather than a sincere effort for reform. Anonymous sources claimed he was manufacturing outrage, using the incident to boost his image. James knew the accusations were meant to distract him, to make him doubt his path. But he also knew he had to stay focused. One morning, as he was preparing for a meeting with the Civil Rights Coalition, Rebecca called him, her voice tense. "James, we have a situation," she began, skipping the usual pleasantries. "There's been a pushback from a powerful lobby within the aviation industry. They're concerned that your reforms will mean stricter regulations for private air travel, which they argue could burden their operations. They're actively trying to discredit you." James's jaw tightened. He had anticipated resistance, but hearing that it was coming from within his own industry stung. "How serious is this?" he asked, keeping his voice steady. "Serious enough that they've started lobbying lawmakers to oppose your campaign," Rebecca replied. "They're painting you as a disruptor in the industry and warning that if your reforms go through, it could drive up costs and complicate security protocols for everyone." James took a slow breath, absorbing her words. This was more than just personal now. It was political. He was up against not just prejudices, but powerful interests who saw his movement as a threat to their bottom line. "All right," he said finally, his voice filled with resolve. "Let's not let them intimidate us. This fight is about people's rights to be treated fairly, regardless of the inconvenience it may cause others. We're not backing down." Rebecca's tone softened slightly, an edge of pride in her voice. "Good. That's what I was hoping you'd say. I'll keep tracking their moves and advising on our next steps." But we need allies, James, powerful ones. James nodded, even though she couldn't see him. I'll make some calls. It's time we bring more people to our side. After ending the call, James sat in his office, thinking carefully about his next move. He needed someone with influence, someone who understood both the stakes and the politics of fighting for systemic change. He made a list, reaching out to prominent civil rights leaders, public figures, and even politicians who had a record of supporting reform. Over the next few days, he scheduled meetings, determined to strengthen his coalition. The first call he received was from an unexpected source, Senator Lisa Monroe, a rising political figure known for her advocacy on issues of justice and equality. Senator Monroe was a passionate reformer, unafraid to take on entrenched interests in her fight for what she believed in. She had seen the coverage of James's story and reached out, offering her support. Mr. Livingstone, she began, her voice steady but warm, I've been following your story, and I believe in what you're doing. This isn't just an isolated issue. It's a reflection of deep-seated problems in our society. I'd like to lend my support to your campaign to help push for meaningful reform. James felt a surge of relief and gratitude. Senator Monroe's endorsement would be a major step forward, bringing legitimacy and political weight to his efforts. Thank you, Senator. Your support means more than I can say, he replied. This fight is bigger than any one of us, and we need leaders like you who aren't afraid to stand up for justice. Over the next few weeks, Senator Monroe joined James at several public events, speaking alongside him at rallies and lending her voice to the movement. Her presence galvanized supporters and brought new attention to the campaign, helping to turn the tide of public opinion in James's favor. Together, they called for specific policy changes, mandatory bias training for law enforcement officers, stricter oversight of airport security protocols, and protections for individuals subjected to unjust scrutiny. The media coverage grew, capturing the attention of national networks and sparking a broader conversation about bias in public spaces. James found himself thrust into the spotlight, his face and story becoming emblematic of a movement that had been years, even decades, in the making. But with every appearance, every speech, he felt the weight of responsibility growing heavier. Late one evening, as he was reviewing the day's progress, his phone rang. It was Marcus, the young law student who had reached out to him a few weeks prior. They had kept in touch, and James had come to see Marcus as a symbol of the younger generation that would carry this movement forward. Mr. Livingstone, Marcus began, his tone excited, I just wanted to tell you that my law school is organizing a panel on racial profiling, and they've asked me to speak. I never would have had the courage to do this without seeing you stand up for what's right. James felt a surge of pride. That's fantastic, Marcus. You have a voice. Use it. This movement is for people like you, who have the courage to demand better. Marcus hesitated, then continued. Thank you. I want you to know that what you're doing, it matters. It's changing things. James smiled, the weight of the day easing slightly. Thank you, Marcus. And remember, this is only the beginning. As James hung up, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. The fight was far from over, but he could see the ripple effects of his actions. People were speaking up, pushing back, refusing to accept the status quo. However, the resistance continued to escalate. Several members of the aviation lobby began funding ads against him, accusing him of undermining business interests and framing his campaign as a personal vendetta. The ads portrayed him as a wealthy businessman who forgot where he came from, a man using his success to advance his own agenda. They twisted his story, focusing on his wealth and success, as if those things made his concerns less valid, as if he were somehow out of touch with the reality of discrimination. But James refused to let these attacks derail him. He took to social media, issuing statements that doubled down on his message, reminding people that his success didn't erase the discrimination he had faced and continued to face. He spoke openly about his experiences, challenging the idea that wealth and success could somehow insulate a person from prejudice. Discrimination doesn't disappear when you reach a certain tax bracket, he wrote in one post. Success doesn't make you immune to injustice. I'm standing up not just for myself, but for everyone who's been told they don't belong, everyone who's been treated as a suspect rather than a human being. This fight is for dignity, equality, and respect. And it's a fight we all have a stake in. The response was overwhelming. Messages of support poured in, not just from individuals, but from other business leaders, activists, and even celebrities who saw the importance of what he was fighting for. James's inbox was flooded with messages from people sharing their own stories of being judged, doubted, and treated unfairly. As the movement grew, so did the pressure on lawmakers. Senator Monroe, who had become a close ally, arranged a series of meetings with other senators, urging them to support a bill that would implement mandatory bias training for law enforcement officers in transportation hubs. The bill, though facing resistance, was gaining momentum, and James knew that every supporter counted. One evening, Senator Monroe invited James to a private dinner to discuss the campaign's progress. As they sat across from each other in the quiet restaurant, she looked at him with a thoughtful expression. "You're doing something remarkable, James," she said. "I've seen a lot of people try to take on issues like this, but very few have had the impact you're having." James nodded, feeling the weight of her words. "Thank you, Senator, but I couldn't do it without people like you backing me." Senator Monroe leaned forward, her gaze intense. "But you have to be prepared for what's coming. The more progress we make, the harder they'll push back. They'll dig deeper, try to find anything they can use against you. You need to be ready." James nodded, understanding the gravity of her warning. He had already faced opposition, but he knew this was just the beginning. The stakes were higher now, and with each step forward, he was threatening the status quo in ways that powerful people wouldn't ignore. "I'm ready," he replied firmly. "I knew this wouldn't be easy, but if it means creating a world where people don't have to fight to be respected, then it's worth it." Senator Monroe nodded, her respect for him evident. "Then let's keep fighting." Over the next few months, the campaign continued to grow, each victory bringing them closer to the goal. More lawmakers voiced their support for the bill, and the aviation lobby's attempts to discredit James began to lose traction as people recognized the authenticity and urgency of his mission. But the battle was far from over. James knew there would be more challenges, more attempts to silence him. Yet with each step, he felt his resolve strengthen, his vision for a fairer, more just society becoming clearer. One evening, as he reviewed the latest updates on the bill, he looked out over the city, feeling a quiet pride in the journey he had taken. He had faced resistance, criticism, and doubt, but he had refused to back down. And now, with the support of allies like Senator Monroe, the voices of people like Marcus, and the strength of the movement behind him, he knew they were on the brink of something monumental. This was no longer just about his story. It was about creating a legacy, about building a future where dignity, respect, and justice were the standards by which everyone was treated. With a deep breath, he closed his laptop, knowing that the fight was only beginning. And this time, he was ready for whatever came next. The tipping point. Months had passed since James first stood on that runway, humiliated and treated like an intruder in a world he had worked so hard to join. What had once been a personal indignity had ignited a movement that now reverberated across the country. Lawmakers, activists, celebrities, and everyday people had rallied around his cause, calling for justice and accountability. The pressure on the aviation industry and law enforcement was mounting, and James could feel the weight of their resistance pushing back harder than ever. But he was undeterred. He had come too far to turn back now. With Senator Monroe's support, the bill they had drafted, the Fair Passage Act, was gaining traction, aiming to reform protocols for profiling in transportation hubs, enforce mandatory bias training, and establish clearer guidelines for accountability in law enforcement. James knew that if passed, this bill would not only protect future travelers, but also signify a seismic shift in the way society addressed discrimination. One late evening, as he was reviewing the latest updates, his phone buzzed with a message from Senator Monroe. "Senator Monroe, we have a hearing scheduled for next week on the bill. They want you to testify. Can you be there?" James felt his heart skip a beat. A congressional hearing would be a major opportunity to bring his story, his movement, and his demands for justice to the highest level. But he knew it would be intense. The hearing would likely include both allies and adversaries, people prepared to support his vision as well as those determined to dismantle it. "James, I'll be there. Whatever it takes, I'll be ready." As he closed the message, he felt a mix of excitement and anxiety. This was it, the moment he had been working toward for months. He spent the next week preparing tirelessly, meeting with Rebecca, Senator Monroe, and other allies to hone his message. They rehearsed questions, anticipating the ways his critics might try to undermine his credibility. He was ready to face them, to present his case with the clarity and conviction that had fueled him from the beginning. The day of the hearing arrived, and James walked into the packed room, his gaze steady as he took in the scene. Reporters and spectators filled the seats, cameras flashing as he made his way to the witness table. He felt the weight of each gaze, some supportive, others skeptical, but he focused on the goal. He was here to make his case, to ensure that his fight would mean something for those who came after him. Senator Monroe was one of the committee members, seated alongside other senators from both sides of the aisle. Some were known allies, but others had publicly voiced their doubts about the bill, citing concerns over regulation or the impact on private aviation. James took his seat, his gaze fixed forward, waiting for the hearing to begin. As the session opened, one of the senators, a middle-aged man with a stern expression, leaned forward and addressed him directly. "Mr. Livingstone, thank you for joining us today. We understand that you've experienced a troubling incident, and we're here to listen to your perspective. But I have to ask, don't you think this bill, as it's written, could cause unnecessary burdens for law enforcement and the aviation industry?" James took a deep breath, choosing his words carefully. "Senator, I understand the concern, but I believe the real burden is the one placed on individuals who are treated unfairly, questioned without cause, and seen as suspects rather than as citizens. This bill isn't about creating obstacles for law enforcement or businesses. It's about ensuring that we uphold the principles of fairness and justice, that we treat everyone with the dignity they deserve." The senator nodded, unconvinced. "But surely you can understand that there are certain protocols that need to be followed, especially in high-security areas like airports. Profiling is, at times, a necessary tool." James felt a flash of anger, but kept his tone measured. "Senator, I'm not suggesting we abandon security protocols. I'm suggesting we improve them. Profiling based on unfounded biases does not enhance security. It undermines it. When we rely on stereotypes rather than evidence, we miss the real threats and instead alienate innocent people who are simply trying to go about their lives." There was a murmur of agreement from some in the room, but others remained stoic, their expressions skeptical. The questioning continued, each senator presenting their arguments, some in support, others pushing back with concerns. But James answered each question with calm conviction, his voice unwavering as he recounted his experience, laying bare the impact of profiling and the toll it took on those subjected to it. Finally, Senator Monroe leaned forward, her voice carrying a tone of authority that quieted the room. "Mr. Livingstone, thank you for your testimony. I believe it's clear that this issue goes beyond one man's experience. It's a systemic problem that requires a systemic solution, and I hope that my colleagues here will recognize the importance of taking meaningful action." With that, the hearing concluded. As James left the room, reporters flocked around him, microphones and cameras thrust toward him as they peppered him with questions. "Mr. Livingstone, do you think the bill will pass? Are you confident that your campaign can bring about real change?" James paused, looking at the sea of faces around him. "Change isn't easy, and it doesn't happen overnight," he replied. "But I believe that if we keep pushing, if we keep speaking out, we can build a world where everyone is treated with the respect they deserve. This isn't just about a bill. It's about who we are as a society." The next few days were a blur of media coverage, interviews, and public appearances. The hearing had galvanized support, and the movement was stronger than ever. But James knew there was one more crucial step: getting the bill through Congress. He spent hours calling senators, rallying supporters, and speaking with activists who had fought similar battles. This was the final push, and he was determined to see it through. At last, the day of the vote arrived. James and his allies gathered in a small room in the Capitol, anxiously watching the proceedings unfold on a screen. As each senator cast their vote, the tension in the room grew, the atmosphere thick with anticipation. Finally, the result was announced. The Fair Passage Act had passed, with a narrow but decisive majority. The room erupted in applause and cheers, a mix of relief and triumph washing over everyone. James felt a swell of emotion as he hugged Rebecca, Senator Monroe, and the others who had supported him. They had done it. After months of relentless effort, they had achieved a victory that would make a tangible difference in people's lives. As the celebrations continued, James took a moment to step outside, the cool evening air a welcome respite. He looked out over the city, feeling a profound sense of accomplishment. But he knew this was only the beginning. The law would need to be enforced, the guidelines followed, and the work of holding people accountable would continue. A voice interrupted his thoughts, and he turned to see Marcus, the young law student, standing nearby. He had joined the campaign a few months earlier, inspired by James's story, and had become one of his most dedicated supporters. "Mr. Livingstone," Marcus began, his voice filled with admiration, "I just wanted to say thank you. What you did, it means a lot. Not just to me, but to everyone who's ever felt like they didn't belong. You made a difference." James smiled, feeling the surge of pride. "Thank you, Marcus. But remember, this fight isn't over. There's still so much work to be done. And people like you, you're the ones who will carry it forward." Marcus nodded, his eyes bright with determination. "I won't let you down." As James watched him walk away, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. He had built a legacy, but more importantly, he had inspired others to continue the work. This wasn't just about one bill or one man's experience. It was about creating a future where people could walk through life without fear of being judged, doubted, or excluded. The next day, as he returned to his office, he found a letter on his desk. It was from the grandmother he had met at the town hall months earlier, the one whose grandson had been profiled. "Dear Mr. Livingstone," the letter began, "I just wanted to say thank you. From the bottom of my heart. My grandson read about the law you helped pass, and for the first time in his life, he feels like he's seen, like he matters. You've given him, and so many others, hope. You have changed lives, Mr. Livingstone, and we are all so grateful." James read the letter twice, a lump forming in his throat as he absorbed her words. This was what he had fought for, not just for himself, but for everyone who had ever felt like they didn't belong. As he folded the letter and placed it in his desk, he felt a quiet resolve settle over him. There would be more battles to fight, more challenges to face, but he was ready. With the support of allies, the strength of his convictions, and the legacy of his journey, he would continue to push for a world where dignity, justice, and respect were not privileges but rights for everyone. And as he looked out over the city, the weight of his mission lifted, replaced by a sense of purpose that would guide him for the rest of his days.